Picture this, it's May 1943. The skies over the Solomon Islands are about to witness something that should be impossible. A lone American fighter pilot pulls back on his throttle, diving towards sea level where the air is thick and his engine should be choking. 7 Japanese Zeros spot him and give chase, confident in their numerical advantage. They're about to learn why you should never underestimate a mechanic with a wrench and a dream. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind: the modification that made this possible? It was technically unauthorized. Against regulations. The kind of thing that could get you court-martialed. Yet this illegal engine mod would help turn the tide of the Pacific War, save countless American lives, and prove that sometimes the best innovations come from breaking the rules. I'm talking about water injection, a modification so controversial that engineers initially banned it, so dangerous that pilots were warned against it, and so effective that it became one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II. Today, we're diving deep into the incredible true story of how a forbidden engine modification transformed the P-38 Lightning from a high-altitude interceptor struggling at sea level into the terror of the Pacific. This is a story of desperation, ingenuity, and the mechanics who refused to watch their pilots die. Let's rewind to 1942, because to understand why this modification was so revolutionary, you need to understand just how desperately it was needed. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was supposed to be America's superweapon. With its distinctive twin-boom design and centerline cockpit, it looked like something out of a science fiction novel. And on paper? It was phenomenal. The P-38 could fly at 40,000 feet. It could reach speeds of 414 miles per hour in level flight. It had the range to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon all mounted in the nose, firing through the propeller arc. No synchronization issues, just pure devastating firepower. But there was a problem. A massive, potentially fatal problem. The Pacific theater wasn't fought at 40,000 feet where the P-38 excelled. Most dogfights with Japanese Zeros happened between sea level and 15,000 feet, exactly where the Lightning's Allison V-1710 engines performed worst. See, the Allison engines in the P-38 were naturally aspirated at lower altitudes. They relied on turbochargers to force air into the cylinders at high altitude. But at sea level, in the thick, humid air of the South Pacific, those turbochargers couldn't compensate for the fundamental thermal limitations of the engine. Here's what was happening: the tropical heat, combined with the engine's operating temperature, meant that the air-fuel mixture inside the cylinders would pre-ignite, literally exploding before the spark plug fired. Engineers call this detonation, and pilots had a more colorful term: the engine eating itself alive. When detonation occurred, you'd hear a distinctive knocking sound, feel the aircraft shudder, and if you didn't immediately reduce power, you'd watch your cylinder head temperatures spike into the red. Pilots had maybe 30 seconds to pull back before the engine would literally destroy itself. Pistons cracking, cylinder heads warping, catastrophic failure. And here's the cruel irony: this usually happened precisely when you needed maximum power most: during takeoff, during a hard climb to escape enemy fighters, or in the desperate moments of a dogfight when your life depended on out-accelerating a Zero. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, one of the Pacific's top aces, later wrote in his memoirs, "We'd see the Zeros coming, push the throttles forward, and pray. Sometimes we'd get the power. Sometimes we'd hear that knock and know we had to choose between blowing our engines or dying." By mid-1942, the situation was critical. P-38 squadrons were reporting engine failures at alarming rates. Pilots were being lost not because they were being outflown, but because their engines quit at the worst possible moments. The brass was getting nervous. Some were even suggesting withdrawing the P-38 from the Pacific entirely, relegating it to European theater duties where high-altitude performance mattered more. That's when the mechanics started experimenting. Now, here's where our story gets really interesting, because the solution didn't come from Lockheed's engineering department in Burbank, California. It didn't come from Wright Field where the Army Air Forces tested aircraft. It came from a group of mechanics working in primitive conditions on a muddy airstrip in New Guinea, men who were tired of watching their friends die because proper procedure said they couldn't try something unconventional. The concept of water injection wasn't new. Engineers had known since the 1930s that injecting water into an engine's intake could cool the air-fuel mixture, preventing detonation. The problem was reliability, weight, complexity, and about a dozen other engineering concerns that made it impractical for production aircraft. But impractical wasn't the same as impossible. Staff Sergeant Paul "Pappy" Gunn, and yes, that was really his nickname, was one of the mechanics who refused to accept the limitations. Gunn was already a legend in the Pacific. Before the war, he'd been a Navy pilot, then a commercial pilot in the Philippines. When war broke out, his wife and children were trapped in Manila. Gunn escaped and immediately volunteered for the Army Air Forces with one goal: get back to the Philippines and rescue his family. While he waited for that opportunity, he poured his frustration into making American aircraft better. And he'd already proven he wasn't afraid to modify aircraft against regulations. He'd been installing forward-firing guns in B-25 bombers, turning them into devastating ground attack aircraft, another, unauthorized, modification that became standard. When Gunn heard about the P-38's detonation problems, he started tinkering. The basic principle was elegant: water has an incredibly high heat capacity. Inject a small amount of water into the air intake, and it would evaporate instantly, absorbing massive amounts of heat in the process. This would cool the air-fuel mixture by 50 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, eliminating detonation and allowing pilots to use full throttle at sea level. But the devil was in the details. How much water? Injected where, exactly? At what pressure? What about corrosion? What if it froze at altitude? What if the system failed mid-flight? Gunn and his team of mechanics worked through the nights, fabricating tanks from drop tank components, rigging injection nozzles from fuel system parts, testing spray patterns with nothing more sophisticated than a garden hose and some wooden blocks. They were, quite literally, making it up as they went along. The first test installation used a 15-gallon tank mounted in the P-38's nose, right behind the armament bay. Water was fed through copper tubing to spray nozzles positioned in the intake manifolds just downstream of the intercoolers. A simple valve allowed the pilot to control injection, flip it on when you needed maximum power, flip it off to conserve water. Was it elegant? No. Was it approved by Lockheed? Absolutely not. Did it work? That's where things got complicated. The first pilot to test Gunn's water injection system was Captain Thomas Lynch, a skilled P-38 pilot with over 200 combat hours and a reputation for being willing to try anything that might give him an edge. On a muggy morning in July 1943, Lynch climbed into the modified P-38, ran through his pre-flight checks, which now included testing the water injection valve, and taxied to the runway. The ground crew watched nervously. If this went wrong, they weren't just risking a plane. They were risking a life. And they were potentially facing court-martial for unauthorized modifications to military aircraft. Lynch pushed the throttles forward. The P-38's engines roared to life. At about 60 knots, he flipped the water injection valve. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The engines, which would normally start showing signs of detonation at full power, ran smooth as glass. The cylinder head temperatures, which usually climbed into the danger zone, stayed comfortably in the green. Lynch lifted off and began his climb. From the ground, it looked perfect. But Lynch was discovering the first serious problem. The water injection worked too well. The engine temperatures dropped so dramatically that the fuel mixture became too rich, loading up the spark plugs. At altitude, when Lynch shut off the water injection and tried to return to normal power, one engine started running rough. He nursed the aircraft back to base and landed safely, but the message was clear: water injection needed refinement. Over the following weeks, Gunn and his team made adjustment after adjustment. They reduced the water flow rate. They experimented with different injection points. They tried adding methanol to the water. Alcohol has an even higher cooling effect and prevents freezing, though it's also highly flammable. They were learning through trial and error, the oldest form of engineering there is. By August, they had a system that worked reliably. Pilots could use water injection for 10 to 15 minutes of maximum power at low altitude without any detonation. That might not sound like much, but in combat, 15 minutes could mean the difference between life and death. Word spread through the fighter squadrons. Pilots started requesting the modification. But here's where the bureaucracy became a problem. Officially, modifying military aircraft without approval from the Army Air Force's Technical Command was forbidden. It violated maintenance regulations, voided warranties, and created liability issues. If a modified aircraft crashed, who was responsible? The engineering brass at Wright Field, when they heard about the water injection experiments, sent a tersely worded telegram. Cease all unauthorized modifications immediately. Water injection systems are not approved for field installation. Any aircraft so modified will be removed from service pending investigation. In other words, stop, or face consequences. Papygun's response was reportedly unprintable, but the gist was, come out here and tell that to the pilots you're sending to die. The standoff could have ended the story right there. But then something happened that changed everything. May 14, 1943. Captain Richard Dick Bond, who would later become America's top ace with 40 confirmed kills, was flying a routine patrol over the Solomon Islands in a P-38 equipped with Gunn's water injection system. At 0900 hours, Bond's flight encountered a formation of Japanese aircraft, 7 Zeros escorting bombers back toward Rabaul. Now, conventional wisdom said that in a 1 versus 7 scenario, especially at low altitude where the Zero excelled, the smart move was to disengage. The Zero was more maneuverable than the P-38. At sea level, without water injection, a Lightning couldn't even reliably outrun a Zero in level flight. But Bond had water injection. And he was curious. He rolled his P-38 inverted and pulled into a steep diving attack, coming down on the Zeros from above. He lined up on the trailing aircraft, and fired a 2-second burst. The Zero disintegrated. The other 6 Zeros immediately broke formation and turned to engage. This was exactly the scenario American pilots dreaded, a turning fight at low altitude with Zeros. Bond didn't turn with them. Instead, he pushed his throttles forward and flipped the water injection valve. What happened next was described by Bond's wingman as physically impossible. The P-38, at less than 5,000 feet where it should have been struggling, accelerated like it had been shot from a cannon. Bond pulled up into a steep climb, something that would normally trigger immediate detonation at full power. The engines didn't miss a beat. He reached 15,000 feet before the pursuing Zeros gave up, unable to match his climb rate. Then Bond rolled over, dove back down, and repeated the tactic, boom and zoom, using his superior speed and energy retention to attack, then escape before the Zeros could bring their maneuverability to bear. By the end of the engagement, Bond had downed 3 Zeros. The other 4 broke off and fled. When Bond landed, his crew chiefs crowded around the aircraft, anxious to check for damage. They found none. The engines were fine. The water tank was 2/3 empty. Everything had worked exactly as designed. More importantly, Bond was alive. And he'd just proven something revolutionary. With water injection, the P-38 could fight on its own terms, even at low altitude against the Zero. Bond's after-action report was forwarded up the chain of command. When it reached General George Kenney, commander of the Far East Air Forces, he read it 3 times. Then he sent his own telegram to Wright Field. The text was simple. Water injection works. My pilots want it. Either approve it or explain to their widows why you didn't. Even then, the engineering brass hesitated. They wanted proper testing. Controlled conditions. Data. General Kenney's response was, again, reportedly unprintable. But he made it clear, he was authorizing water injection installations on every P-38 in the Pacific Theater, with or without approval from Wright Field. It was a remarkable moment. A field commander essentially telling the engineering establishment to step aside because lives were at stake. Within weeks, mechanics across the Pacific were installing water injection systems. Lockheed engineers, realizing they were being bypassed, finally traveled to the combat zones to see the modifications firsthand. What they found surprised them. When Lockheed's engineers examined Gunn's water injection system in September 1943, they expected to find a crude, dangerous modification that somehow worked despite violating every principle of proper engineering. Instead, they found a system that was remarkably well designed. Yes, it was built from scavenged parts. Yes, it lacked the refinement of a factory installation. But the fundamental engineering was sound. Gunn and his mechanics had independently arrived at many of the same solutions that Lockheed's own research teams had been exploring in their laboratories. The injection points were positioned correctly. The flow rates were in the right ballpark. The system even included a clever safety feature. If the water tank ran dry, the injection valve would automatically close, preventing the pump from running dry and failing. These mechanics, working with hand tools in primitive conditions, had accomplished in months what formal engineering programs had been struggling with for years. The Lockheed engineers' report to the company was remarkable for its honesty. The field modification is effective and generally safe. With minor refinements, it should be adopted as a standard feature. By October 1943, Lockheed began factory installing water injection systems on new P-38s destined for the Pacific. The system was refined, a proper 20-gallon tank, stainless steel tubing instead of copper, better injection nozzles, a cockpit gauge to monitor water level. But the fundamental design remained Pappy guns. More importantly, the performance gains were staggering. With water injection, P-38s could maintain full throttle at sea level for up to 15 minutes without detonation. This translated to a 20% increase in effective horsepower at low altitude, the difference between 1,425 horsepower and over 1,700. In practical terms, it meant a P-38 could accelerate from 200 to 400 miles per hour in about 30 seconds less time. It could outclimb zeros up to 20,000 feet. It could outrun anything the Japanese had at any altitude. The impact on combat effectiveness was immediate and measurable. Before water injection, P-38 squadrons in the Pacific had loss rates of about 3 to 5% per mission. After water injection became standard, those rates dropped to under 2%. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The real impact was psychological. American pilots, who had been flying with one hand on the throttle and one eye on their engine temperature gauges, could now fight aggressively. They could use their aircraft's full performance envelope. They could dictate the terms of engagement. Major Thomas McGuire, who had become the second highest-scoring American ace of the war, later said, "Water injection didn't just make the P-38 faster. It made us fearless. We knew we could push the engines to the limit and they wouldn't quit on us. That confidence is worth more than horsepower." The Japanese noticed too. Intelligence reports from captured documents showed that Japanese pilots were warned about modified P-38s with exceptional low-altitude performance. Some reports even claimed, incorrectly, that Americans had developed a new engine. In reality, the engine was the same. The modification was simple. But the effect was revolutionary. By 1944, water injection had spread beyond the P-38. P-47 Thunderbolts received it. P-51 Mustangs got it. Even some B-29 Superfortresses were equipped with water injection to boost takeoff performance when heavily loaded with bombs. An unauthorized modification that engineers had initially banned became one of the most important technological advances of the air war. So what happened to the people behind this incredible innovation? Pappy Gunn continued his unauthorized modifications throughout the war. His work on the B-25 gunship conversions, remember those, was officially recognized in 1945 when he received the Distinguished Service Cross. After the war, he stayed in the Philippines, finally reuniting with his family. He never received official recognition for the water injection system. The military, somewhat embarrassed that a battlefield fix had outperformed their engineering programs, quietly let Lockheed take credit for the development. But the pilots knew. In countless memoirs and interviews, Pacific veterans credited Gunn and his team of mechanics with saving their lives. Dick Bond, the pilot who proved water injection's effectiveness in that 7-versus-1 engagement, survived the war with 40 confirmed kills. Tragically, he died in August 1945, just days before Japan's surrender, when a P-38 jet he was test flying suffered a fuel system failure. Thomas Maguire, who so valued the confidence water injection gave him, was killed in January 1945 in a low-altitude dogfight over the Philippines. He had 38 confirmed kills. But thousands of other pilots did come home, many owing their survival to an engine modification that shouldn't have worked, wasn't supposed to exist, and had been explicitly banned by the very engineers whose job was to keep them alive. The water injection story had one more chapter though, a surprising one. After World War II, as military aviation transitioned to jet engines, water injection faded from fighter aircraft. Jets didn't suffer from detonation the same way piston engines did. But water injection found a new home in commercial aviation. Many early jet airliners used water injection to boost takeoff thrust in hot weather or at high-altitude airports. If you've ever seen a 1960s-era Boeing 707 or Douglas DC-8 leaving a trail of black smoke on takeoff, that was the water methanol injection system at work. Even more surprisingly, water injection is making a comeback in modern engines. Some high-performance BMW cars use it to prevent knock in their turbocharged engines. Experimental aircraft engines are revisiting the technology. Engineers are once again discovering what Pappy Gunn knew in 1943. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones. So here's what we've learned today. The story of how engineers banned an engine modification, only to see it outrun 7 zeros at sea level, isn't really a story about engineering at all. It's a story about desperation breeding innovation. It's about mechanics who refused to watch their friends die because, proper procedure, said they couldn't try something new. It's about pilots who trusted those mechanics enough to bet their lives on an unauthorized modification. And it's about the eternal tension between careful, methodical engineering and the urgent demands of the battlefield, where good enough today is better than perfect in 6 months. The engineers who initially banned water injection weren't wrong to be cautious. Their concerns about reliability, safety, and unintended consequences were valid. In any other context, their approach would have been correct. But war doesn't give you the luxury of perfect solutions. Sometimes you have to try things, fail, learn, and iterate. Sometimes the best engineering comes not from laboratories but from people with wrenches and problems that need solving right now. Pappy Gunn and his team of mechanics gave American pilots in the Pacific a fighting chance. They took an aircraft that was struggling at low altitude and turned it into a dominant force. They saved countless lives with nothing more than copper tubing, a water tank, and a stubborn refusal to accept limitations. That's the real legacy of water injection, not the horsepower gains or the combat victories, but the reminder that innovation often comes from unexpected places, and that sometimes the best way to solve an impossible problem is to ignore the people telling you it can't be done. If you enjoyed this deep dive into aviation history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the innovations, the people, and the incredible machines that changed warfare forever. Drop a comment below. What other unauthorized modifications or battlefield innovations would you like us to cover? The Jeep? The bazooka? The hedgerow cutters on Sherman tanks? History is full of these stories, people solving problems in the field that experts said couldn't be solved. And we're going to keep telling them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.